you know, the core, maybe the core teaching of Christianity. It's not love. It's not, you know, do unto others even, or any of that. It is the incarnation. That's the central story. That's the central teaching, because that's the union of heaven and earth. That's where getting to that state of consciousness where you can see earth and heaven together. Okay, well, today I thought we'd talk about perception and perspective. And this is kind of a new area of study for me, so I'm going to just kind of wade into it and rely on your feedback and your understanding. But what we're going to look at is the difference between the two, what perception is and what perspective is, and how it applies to us in our spiritual work and in our everyday lives. So you've heard me say many times that your imagination is an organ of perception. And this is why I want to go into this, because if we can understand the difference between perception and perspective, we can perhaps get a leg up on how better to use our imagination. Because what we're often encountering is our subjective experience of a thing and not really analyzing or judging it. So how that looks is, say we go in and we want to visualize light. And so we picture perhaps a column of light behind us, or maybe an egg-shaped sphere around us, and we fill that with light. And we can actually start to see it, but it's strictly an experience, and we're not really looking at it objectively. So we can argue that if we're too objective in what we experience, we're not really experiencing it. And if we are only perceiving our reality, then how do we know the degree of its subjectivity? In other words, how can we really understand anything in a universal sense if we can't distinguish it from our perception of it? So I think that in order to be a skillful spiritual worker who's able to not only experience but operate within the spiritual realm, then we have to learn how to change our perspective, which really means just multiple points of view. So the way we see this show up today in today's world is that a lot of people are perceiving the world, but not really giving it any thought in terms of how other people see the world. We oftentimes assume that our friends especially are seeing what we're seeing, and most of the time we're wrong. And yeah, right? So what we're doing in this work, by trying on different perspectives. So when it comes to light and seeing light, then we want to think about what that light is and not just get lost in the experience of it. So if we look at that briefly, we could say that, well, light is a phenomenon that we encounter when we get in touch with the invisible life force within the body, because we can feel the life energy in our bodies, but we can't really see it. But through suggestion and through the use of the imagination, we can look into the life force and then see that it is the feelable component of an invisible energy, which we call light. So we want then to examine that and see, well, what is light? Is it just the visible component of nerve energy? Because the energy in our body is really grounded in the sensation we have of being alive. So that's our interface with the world, is our nervous system. But the nervous system is also our interface with the spiritual world. So just that one little piece of knowledge there is enough to change your perspective when it comes to perceiving light. So we know what it's like to have a physical body, and when we bump into things, it hurts. When we get a massage, it feels good. When we look at something, we perceive it with our eyes, and we compare it to what we've seen before. Same with sounds and music, we tend to gravitate towards music we already are familiar with, and our brains are wired so that they prefer to operate in the field of the known. So it's difficult to question what we're seeing because the brain, like a gyroscope, always wants to return to a default position, and that default position is the known. So the act of changing our perspective takes effort, takes energy to get the mind up out of the rut and into a position, into a different position where we can perceive the same thing only from a different position. And that's going to give us a different perspective. So as we seek to experience light, spiritual light, the Christ light, then it helps to know such things such as we regard the Christ as the Lord of the sun, that there's a literal physical astronomical entity at the center of the solar system we call the sun. We know that it gives, that all of our life energy comes from it, that without the sun, we would quickly perish. But in spiritual work, we begin to see and understand that there's a spiritual component to the sun as well. Just as we have a physical body, we can look at ourselves or look at other people, and if we change our perspective, we shift our understanding to a different position, then we can begin to realize that there's a lot to us that is invisible. We don't see each other's minds. We don't see each other's auras, even, not usually. We don't see each other's level of vitality except through cues that may or may not be correct, right? Somebody can be perfectly healthy but look tired, or be perfectly healthy and have a cold, something like that. Or they can look in other words, it's hard to tell a person's life energy when all we have to go by are physical, visible cues. So part of the spiritual path is developing our senses so that we can see more than the physical, so that we can start to see the energy both in ourselves and in other people. And the way that energy shows up in our visual frame of reference is as light. So by using the imagination, we can we can begin, we can create, we can conjure up an image of light, like the column of light or the sphere of light. And by doing that, what we're doing is we are priming the pump, you might say. So we're using our imagination to lay a template, and then if that template is resonant enough with the reality, then the reality will show up and reshape our mental image. So we begin, we prime the pump with an image, say it's an image of a candle, like a candle flame and the glow of the candle flame. Once we have that in mind, then the next step will be an actual experience of the radiance of that. We'll get the actual feeling of the expansive globular movement of energy out in all directions from that candle flame in the form of light. And then we may, because we're thinking about it and changing our perspective. If you think about it, the candle exercise and the orange exercise both are an exercise in changing our perspective. We take one thing and we look at it from many different angles. We look at it analytically and then deductively. So in other words, we take it apart piece by piece, and we, like with the orange, then we plant the seed, and then we watch it grow and expand into the full-grown tree. So this business of perception and perspective is very important to us on the spiritual path. And we want to realize that perception is somewhat passive in nature, because it's what we see, it's what we, and what we see is governed by what we value, or what we want. We tend to see those things that we think are important, and we ignore the things that we think are unimportant. And so this shapes our perception. This literally keeps us from seeing most of what there is to see. So perspective, to change our perspective, takes a real effort on our part. We have to be intentional. We have in changing our position in relation to the thing we're seeing or hearing or feeling. So, and that's not easy, and it's not natural. Animals don't really have perspective. We do, because of this part of our brain, the frontal cortex. So we want to exercise that, and we can use words like discernment or judgment. We want to be able to evaluate, because as we do so, what we're doing is we're breaking out of our subjectivity, and we're starting to enter into a place where we can actually be objective in our perception of the world, in our understanding. So, well, first of all, I'll open it up for questions, and then I'll go into another area of this.
Michael, when you threw this out today, or that sent us in advance the topics, I began to think about it. And it seems very hard. You started out talking about subject-object perception, right? So, for example, right now I'm sitting here as the subject. We have a Zoom meeting that is the object of my perception. It just seems very hard, the subjective component, for me to express the subjective component in any sort of universal terms or ways that you guys would understand, just because I'm different. My experience is different. It just seems very difficult to talk about. And that I mean to get across, right?
Mm-hmm.
So whenever we have these conversations about what is our internal experience of God, I maybe if we were connected like that pod in Sense8, we could feel each other, right? And maybe that's what we're trying to get at through discussion. But or maybe it's developing a different perception organ altogether. I don't know. But that's what's coming up for me is how difficult for me for me to understand when Michael talks about his inner, where is his inner experience of God. I can hear it. And I can say, okay, that maybe I understand what he's saying. But then, or if I go to my meditative experience this morning and what my experience of inner is, and I try to bring that forth to you guys, it just seems very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Right. And ironically, though, Tom, you're a physical therapist. And when I came to you with a sore shoulder,
Yeah.
you knew exactly what to do.
Yes. Well, that's right. That's true. Yeah.
And why? Why? Because there is essentially no difference between my body and your body.
There you go.
Or anybody
Yeah.
else's body.
Right.
So the problem that I've been running up against my entire adult life is people thinking that they are unique spiritually.
Oh yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you said that. There's this concept and Renee and I, you guys know, we talk about recovery. There's this concept in recovering of an isolated viewpoint of the addict is that we are terminally unique.
Yeah.
No one has,
yeah, I get that.
no one has gone through what I've gone through, right?
Right, right. Well, at one point in my life, I came to realize that I was no different from anybody else. And and came up with I am a slice of life taken from the center of the loaf.
That's nice.
So we know, and you know, this is not a new subject. Manly Palmer Hall wrote about the esoteric anatomy of men. And we have just almost unlimited amount of literature, especially from the East, when it comes to understanding the meridians and pressure points and activation points within the physical body. Those have been mapped out for thousands of years. And one of the most ancient symbols is the caduceus. It's at least 5,000 years old, probably much older than that. The dawn of civilization is getting pushed back farther and farther and farther all the time. And the caduceus itself is the central, the spinal cord, the two serpents that are coiled around it going up the staff are the 𝗪 and 𝗶𝗃𝗃, or positive and negative currents within the body. Or the Hindus call them the 𝗪 and 𝗶𝗃𝗃 forces. And you know, the knob on top of the caduceus that's the brain stem. The wings are the lungs and the spiritual aspect, because you have the lungs deal with air is breath, that's ruach, spirit, prana. The breath is central to us. That's why we observe our breathing in meditation, in some systems. So what we're dealing with is a well-mapped physical physiology, but also a neurophysiology and spiritual physiology, you might call it. So these things are not new, but within the spiritual community, we are mostly dealing with terminal uniqueness. Everybody thinks they're special. My truth is different from your truth. So we get into this absurd relativism when it comes to spiritual growth and development, soul development. You know, and then you get people who say, well, how can you know me? Right?
Michael, I think Buddhism
Yeah.
would say that is technically true at the relative level, although it's not true at the absolute level. So that's a provisional teaching, obviously, but they do differentiate in order to help distinguish between the two and enabling people to get to the absolute level where there is no difference. And then they come back and say, well, it's all one. But yeah, but there is like a distinction in our paths at the relative level. So in the world of duality, which we have to deal with every day, there is some truth to the fact that people do have different paths and different experiences and so forth, but yet there is that common ground that you're trying to get at. I think that the absolute truth, that we are all one at one level. So I'm just throwing that out there to say that that's how Buddhism tends to look at it, and I find it kind of useful.
Yes, yes, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that is the counterpoint to this. That in terms of content, we are unique because we have different experiences. Where we can get caught up in that, in subjectivity, is where we think that, like we were saying before, that no one else has had this experience that I'm having now. And I think at a certain level, that's true, depending on how much you're experiencing what you're experiencing in the moment, how fully and how clear your mind is, and how clearly receptive you are to the experience. That can make a difference. Or in other words, how conscious you are and what kind of perspective you have. But if you're not so conscious and you are you're going through a human experience, say like I remember watching a person, these friends that I have, and this goes back 30 years or so, but they got married when she was quite young. I think she was like 16 when they got married, and he was a few years older than she was. But the marriage was good, you know. At first, it like most marriages, they got off on a good start, and they had kids. But as they grew older, they started to grow apart, and they both knew it, and they both realized that they should go their separate ways and bless each other and go find a new life. And but I watched him, even though he knew that, because he could shift into that perspective, I saw him get consumed by the generic experience, human experience of separation, as a negative. And I saw him lose the perspective of this is good and right, and it's part of our growth and development that we're doing this cooperatively and you know, with good intention. I watched that just get clouded over by the mass mind idea of divorce and how that just took him down. He could not hold that perspective because of this generic human experience, which is everywhere, and it's embodied in our flesh, where we feel the physical pain of being separated from a partner, right? It's like our energy bodies are just pulled apart like that, and that's painful. So all of this to say that a lot of what we experience as human beings, pretty generic. You know, it's categorized. I mean, even our temperament has been categorized into 5 major personality types, which governs our preferences and our outlook. We've got things like the Enneagrams and astrology and these other ways of measuring personality, which form like an intermediate layer. We have this subjective view of ourselves, but then we have this framework through which we're experiencing our own subjectivity. And if we're objective about that, then we realize, wow, most people experience pretty much the same thing in the same way. It's modified by a lot of adjectives, you might say, and the contents of our experiences. They're almost infinite in what we can experience, but the framework within which we have these experiences is pretty much the same at that intermediate level. But if we increase our consciousness, our level of consciousness, then we start to get more and more, we differentiate in our experience. But at these lower levels of consciousness, we're pretty much, it's hard to tell us apart. So you're right in that, we have to recognize that we are different. I mean, you've had different life experiences, but at one level, our experiences could be categorized into roughly the same categories. But if we continue to develop our consciousness, then we have the opportunity to really go off in different, unique directions. So part of humility is recognizing that, at some levels, we're pretty much the same. And that's a realistic and that's a good solid base platform to stand on, because from there, if we recognize that we're pretty much all the same, that then makes it possible to explore places that are truly unique to us. But if we think we're unique from the get-go, then those realms of consciousness and experience that truly are unique are unavailable to us because we can't even see them. We're stuck in a concept of like Tom said, terminal uniqueness, which can be very limiting to our perception. So what I'm offering you now is like a different perspective, right? By describing these layers of human experience in terms of generic, and then, going beyond the generic into the unique, that's a different way of looking at it. It's a different position. And the purpose of doing that is to give us greater agency and perhaps new experiences that heretofore were unavailable. Have I succeeded? Have I shifted your perspective, put you in a different position?
I'm kind of mentally comparing it to existing models, sorry.
Oh, yeah, of course, of course.
Yeah, what comes to mind for me is spiral dynamics, which are integral and spiral dynamics are both related, Ken Wilber and so forth. And what comes to mind is that phrase transcend and include, where he does actually go into a more individuated personality. But I think the other side of that, which is actually saying that some of the Eastern religions are actually saying what is more basic to us is not the individuality itself, but the awareness behind it, the consciousness. I don't want to use the word consciousness. There's a lot of ambiguity out there in the spiritual world about that, but the being the 𝗪 Ananda, you're maybe familiar with those terms. The being and the consciousness behind it is the most basic thing. And it is also the most common thing that everybody has. And if you're a panentheist, even the rocks have, there's a kind of a top-down and a bottom-up way to look at it. And that's what's coming to me when we talk about that.
Yes, yes. I distinguish between awareness and consciousness. In the meditation technique that I have, it's an easy way to back up into the column of light, which then becomes like a portal, and we go into that non-dual state of consciousness. And there is no personality. There is no subjectivity. Subjectivity, time, space, subjectivity, objectivity, it all vanishes. And we're in this field of infinite awareness and infinite potential energy. So, and this is what's common to all of us. This is what we can say we are. And that's truly a unified field where you could say there's only one person. There's only one thing, one awareness. And we become, everything drops away and we become one with that, and it changes our perspective forever. So that's
yeah, there's like always in duality, there's always like two ways to look at things. Yeah, So yeah, so there's like that would be like, I guess, the bottom up compared to like an integral model where it says everything gets more complex as you go up. It's well, yes, or more unified, I guess, as you go up.
Yeah.
More complex, but at the same time more unified. It's confusing.
Yeah, and so we want to find a way to experience that, and as we experience it, then the duality starts to come into focus, and we begin to see, well, duality is every bit as important as non-duality. The two sides of the same coin, you might put it. I mean, that's not accurate, but just for a working model, we find that that duality is necessary for creation. That possibility. What good is infinite possibility if there's no way to realize it or to explore it? This is like in Hinduism, this would be going all the way back to the sources of reality, right? To the source, and the intention. In Christianity, we call that intention, the activity, the intention of God in its active mode, we call that the Holy Spirit. It's like the spirit of the whole thing, that there's an intention and that there's a movement, there's a personality, and that personality is in action. And so we call that the Holy Spirit. So we're in a creation that is dynamic. And in order to have dynamism, you have to have duality, because dynamism is dependent upon polarity. And so that's the beauty of Christianity, esoteric Christianity, in that we recognize that, and that we recognize that the world is important, that the world of duality has a sacredness to it, every bit as much as the non-dual world. So in approaching, I mean, how can we be real and deny the dual nature of reality? You see, we can't, because we'd be leaving out, again, this doesn't really fit, but half of reality. We only see the dual, that's half. We only see the non-dual, that's only half. So
one perspective of reality, I guess.
Yeah. So another way we can use this approach to perception and perspective is like with sacred scripture. And the one we know best, or I know the best is the Bible. And you have different perspectives. Some people look at the Bible as the unerring word of God, as though God wrote the Bible itself, right? So then you have another perspective. Well, you know, the Bible is a collection of symbolic stories, myths that are descriptive of an inner reality and plays out the dynamism of our inner reality through the vehicle of external narrative or stories. So the stories such as the Garden of Eden and the flood and Cain and Abel, Tower of Babel, all of these things are symbolic stories, myths, grand narratives that describe inner realities. So everything in the Bible is saying something about us. So there's an example of perception versus perspective, because we have to intentionally approach the Bible from that perspective in order to perceive the Bible at that level of interpretation. Right? And the same goes with the Bhagavad Gita, you know, with Arjuna and Krishna. Arjuna's in his chariot. He's overlooking the battlefield where his relatives are fighting and killing each other. And Krishna, which is the Krishna consciousness, the higher self, the observer self, higher being, a greater being, is there right behind him. See, again, behind, you know, it's behind. And there's a reason for that. And Krishna is advising Arjuna how to comport himself in the world from the standpoint of a non-dual perspective, but in action in the dual world. So we see kind of a recapitulation of that, because I think that's an older story. It may or may not be older than the Garden of Eden story, where you have two people being kicked out of a certain state of consciousness. They're expelled from that, and they have to enter into a new state of consciousness or self-awareness. They go from a non-dual state of just being one with nature and one with their own bodies and just acting unconsciously and instinctually, to all of a sudden waking up to self-awareness. They become aware of themselves as discrete beings. So they lose their instinctual connection with nature, a good part of it, and all of a sudden they see each other as individuals. And then, you know, that's when kind of history begins. So all of this is dependent on how we position ourselves in relation to these ideas. That's perspective. And can we hold maybe two or three different positions and examine something from different angles, from multiple angles, and by doing so, and through triangulation, you might say, begin to see reality take shape in a way that it couldn't before. If we're limited to one perception or one perspective, one position, which is, it's always from our position, right? I mean, everybody sees themselves as the center of the universe, and everything relates to them personally. So just getting out of ourselves and seeing the other person, seeing through their eyes how they see the world, that's a huge leap in consciousness. Not many people can do that. I mean, you know, psychologists and salespeople, teachers, they start to do that, and you know, sometimes they get really good at it. But for most people, They only see the world through their eyes. They never see the world through anybody else's. So that's a huge disadvantage. And I think that you know, the greatest commandment was do unto others as you would have others do unto you. What's required to do that? You have to get inside them and look at you and see how they are seeing you. Otherwise, how are you going to know what to give them or what to do unto them? Because unless you know that, you may try to do unto others in a way that they don't want, right? So there's so these basic teachings are buried. In order to really understand the Bible, you have to read between the lines. You almost have to rise up in consciousness, change your perspective to a more universal perspective before you can see what it's saying. Because how would you ever be able to tell that that's what the golden rule is talking about? Because it's not specified. It's not laid out for us. We have to think about it. In order to do unto others as we would have them do unto us, there's so much implied in that we may not ever see it. We might not ever see the implications. And the number one implication is get out of yourself, get inside the other person, and then look back at you. How are you seeing me? What is your perspective when it comes to me? See, that's just kind of a shift in subjectivity. I can be aware of how I'm experiencing the world, but how is the world experiencing me? See, in order for me to do that, I have to get out of my subjectivity and put my consciousness somewhere other than encased within this physical body and this physical mind. And by doing that, that's an automatic, you automatically rise up in an order of magnitude above the normal, ordinary subjective consciousness. It's a big leap. So, and people will bend over backwards to keep from doing that, you know, and they'll say things like, well, your truth is your truth, different from my truth, you know. We slip into relativism so that the ego can protect itself from anonymity, right? The worst thing for the ego is to be anonymous. The ego wants to stand out. The ego wants to be special. It wants to you know, undock itself and sail its own ocean. But when we do this very simple exercise of getting out of ourselves, and that's, you know, that's why we take vows of service, for instance, because in order to serve effectively, it's like the golden rule again. How can we serve effectively if what we're trying to do for other people is something that is just a concept that we have about what they need, instead of really letting them either tell us what we need or get out of ourselves and get inside them and then see through their eyes so that we can know what they need.
Michael, what you said about the golden rule, I appreciate that. I've never thought about it that way, because I've always thought about it as, okay, I'm not going to do to this person something that I wouldn't want done back to me. So that's the Jewish
form. Do not do unto others what you would not have others do to you.
Right. But just talking about it now, I see how self-centered that is, and that possibly what I'm doing in that mindset is projecting what I want onto somebody else in hopes that that turns around and comes back to me, rather than
that That happens in relationships. I want you to touch me this special way, so I'm going to touch you that way. But the other person saying, why is she touching me like that? It's almost like it's like a trick, right? Something we've all been tricked. And the trick is we think of ourselves as separate individuals. We don't realize that we're joined at the hip, you know. So we get stuck in the dual consciousness and we think that everything relates to us. And in order to get out of that, we have to learn how to be objective and to consider other people. Maybe for the first time ever, you know, to all of a sudden become actually aware of other people as they are, not as we project onto them. It's very tricky, not easy, but not impossible. Another way we can look at this is content versus context, because we, like with ourselves, we think, well, my experiences are unique to me. You know, I did different things growing up. I had these parents. I went to these schools, these relationships, you know, all of those, I tend to think, well, that's unique to me. And to some extent, they are, but that's all content. The contents of my life are different from the contents of your life. But the context, that could be almost identical. The context might be, you know, we're Americans. We were born and grew up in a national identity and a culture and a history, you know, it's part of the culture. And so that has shaped us to a large extent. And you often hear people say, boy, the best way to grow is to travel, you know, get out of your culture and get into another culture. And then you see that, you know, the world is much more varied than you thought it was. And then it expands your consciousness and you learn more and you get different content, you know. But even there, you're still in a context, but it's a larger context. So you can, with different perspectives within that. So you might even say that perspective is context dependent, because you can only have a perspective within a larger context. And then spiritual work is expanding that context more and more until you get outside of the context. And that's getting into non-dual consciousness, or at least to experience the way non-dual consciousness can affect your dual consciousness. Because that's really and that's what Jesus was talking about when he said, I and my Father are one. See, so there's two, I and my Father. So that's the polarity, that's the duality, are one. And that's like the top point of the triangle. You have oneness, but within that oneness, you have two, you have dual. You see? So, and this is like, this is that's the greater context within which we live. We live within a unified field, but we experience it in a duality. All of this is couched within the esoteric Christian teachings. And all of the esoteric Christian teachings are mirrored within the exoteric. You know, so in the exoteric, you have things like the Trinity and heaven and hell, the resurrection, the ascension. All of these things are like the narratives, the myths that are a depiction of internal realities, things that we actually go through as we get out of ourselves and expand our consciousness.
Did you say that again, Michael? I'm just kidding. Sorry.
Good, because I don't think I could. I've already forgotten it. What was I saying?
I love the topic. It's thought-provoking.
Yeah, that's what I do. I provoke thinking.
You're an instigator.
But I'm an instigator, troublemaker. So, but the purpose of thinking about these things is to find different perspectives and to get as many different perspectives as possible, you know, within reason, so that we can see all sides. It's like the four blind men trying to describe the elephant, right? They're all blind, and they've all got hold of a different part of the elephant. And one person says, "God, the elephant is like a big leaf, you know, and he's got the ear." And the other guy says the elephant is like a tree trunk. He's got a hold of a leg, you know. So you've got these different perspectives. But if you take away their blindness and you give them the overall, you know, if you take all of those different perspectives and start to put them together, then the animal itself starts to emerge. This is the greatest value of comparative religions, because I've learned more about Christianity by studying Buddhism than I ever could if I didn't. And Taoism. I mean, they're all essentially the same. Now, here's a perspective I would like you to really adopt, really try it on, that the exoteric comes from the esoteric. The esoteric was first. All major religions begin with the spiritual experience of its founder. And then the founder, like when Buddha came into enlightenment, the gods said, "We need you to teach this." And he just shot right back with, "This cannot be taught." He said, "So instead of teaching the experience, I'm going to teach the way to the experience." You see? So he began to teach. He developed this entire body of teachings, didn't write anything down himself, but he had scads of people around him writing everything down. And that became a religion. You know, it was a body of teachings that needed to be administrated, so they built up an institution to safeguard and to maintain the integrity of the teachings of Gautama Buddha. Same thing exactly happened with Jesus. So Jesus never wrote anything himself. Lots of people did for him.
There's another way of looking at it too, though. The exoteric also causes the esoteric to emerge. If you didn't have those external patterns, you know, the idea of acting as though something's true, you know, acting according to what you wish to perceive. I guess I'm just seeing the opposite of that as well, where you have this perceived external pattern. Part of the reason why we do ritual, you may not understand the esoteric behind the ritual until you embody that ritual fully, and then the esoteric emerges from within at that point. I'm just toying with the idea, but it seems true as well.
Yeah. And there's this great book by Robert Heinlein called Orphans of the Sky. You know who Robert Heinlein is, don't you? He's really one of the most popular science fiction authors in the 20th century. And in his book, Orphans of the Sky, he tells the story of this huge spaceship that is launched towards Arcturus 4 light years away. And it's going to take hundreds and hundreds of years to get there. And so this large vessel, it's shaped like a cylinder, you know, this big long cylinder, which rotates along its long axis. So it has multiple decks inside the cylinder, all radiating out from the center. So as this thing turns, you have gravity on the outer decks. There are no windows on the exterior of the ship. In order to observe space, you have to go to the center and then all the way to the front where there's an observation deck. So, and everybody knows this. They know they're going to live and die on this thing, and that their children and their children's children, for quite a ways, they're all going to live and die on this ship. So they develop stories about what the trip is all about. You know, we used to live on Earth. We're now living on a ship, and we're going towards this different solar system to explore it. That's the narrative. 100 years or so into the trip, the dissension breaks out, and they have a civil war. And one side stays in the outer decks, and the other side goes to the upper decks, you know, because towards the center of this cylinder is up.
Oh, yeah. Cool.
Right? Because, yeah, and the closer you get there, the less gravity there is and all of that. So it's a whole different thing. And the people who are living in the upper decks, they have access to the observation deck. Nobody else, the other side of the war, doesn't. So another couple of 100 years go by, and all of that original story about the purpose of the trip and the destination and the origin, all of that gets turned more and more into a kind of a mythology, to where they forget what they're up to. They start to believe that the ship is the whole of reality. That's all that exists, is the ship. So, and this is so extreme that the bulkhead of the ship, or the outermost skin, you know, like the hull of a boat, where there are no windows, when they reach, you know, when they're on that level and they see the bulkhead, it's not a bulkhead. It's not a wall. It's simply the end of reality. That's just where reality stops. They can't even imagine something on the other side of it, because there is no other side. It's just the end. That's where everything ends, right there. So the hero of the story, I forget how exactly it happens, but he explores the upper decks. He goes higher and higher, and there's just like this no man's land, a couple of decks in between the two where nobody goes, but he gets through that, and he gets captured by the other people, and they take him to the observation deck. And for the first time, here's a person who his whole life and his whole culture has told him that the greatest expanse, the greatest volume of space, is like maybe an atrium where two floors are joined. So he can see maybe 30 feet. That's as far as anybody ever sees, is like 30 feet, or maybe down a hallway or something like that. So he gets taken to the observation deck where there's this windshield, and he looks out at the stars. The experience of that causes him to double over and experience extreme nausea. And it mentally destabilizes him to the point where he almost becomes deranged, because he's confronted with a reality now that exceeds by many orders of magnitude his conceptual understanding of reality. He just blows his mind. It just blows his mind. And gradually he gets acclimatized to that, and then he's able to go down to the rest of the people, and the story goes on from there. But the point is that this change of perspective And how did you put it, Jesse? You were looking at the other side of it?
Oh,
You're looking at it from the other direction?
The exoteric could
Yeah.
also be the cause of the emergence of the esoteric.
Right, right. Well, I think that, you know, on the initiatory path, the path of initiation, the very first, and initiation is when we go through that kind of experience where we get our minds blown. Like the guy, you know, seeing outer space for the first time. And it's not that he saw outer space, but with that came the realization that he's on a ship, and the ship has a purpose. It's got a destination, it's got an origin, it's got a history. All of that comes crashing in on him. But all of that stuff is like the exoteric. This is what's obvious to the physical senses and the mythology that's grown up around. It's even when people die, instead of saying they died, they would say, he made the trip. But they had no concept of what that meant. It's really a good story. It was fun. So the exoteric is that, but the path of initiation begins with the realization, the nagging, like in the Matrix, as you know, Morpheus is telling Neo, says it's like a splinter in your mind. You know that something's not right. You know that what you're seeing is like painted on the surface of something. Even though it's three-dimensional, you know there's much more to reality than what you're seeing. You have no idea what that is. And maybe that's what induced the hero of that story to explore the upper decks, because the unknown just bothered him so much that he had to find out. So the exoteric can give you a kind of a context within which to launch towards the unknown, because you get a sense that it's not the whole story, or that it's concealing a deeper reality, a deeper meaning. And
you don't. I'll let you finish your thought there. I was going to say something.
Yeah, well, you know, you hear the stories. You know, you hear the story of like Noah's Ark, for instance. Something inside of you says, yes, that's real. Another part of you says, no, it's not real, because, you know, like all the skeptics say, how could he have gotten all of the, you know, two of every kind of animal, right? I mean, all the animals in the world today would have had to have been on the ark as a pair. And we know that would just be impossible. So our rational mind denies the reality that we sense intuitively. Something about that story is real. And so in that way, and that story is the exoteric. In that way, the exoteric can pull us into the esoteric because we sense its reality. But the esoteric was there before the exoteric. The exoteric was a depiction of an inner reality. You see, we didn't make up a story and then accidentally fall into a reality that story depicts. You know, we had the inner experience, the spiritual experience, and then we made up the stories to symbolically represent them.
Does this person in Heinlein's book, does he ever escape the ship?
Oh, I don't think it goes that far, because they had a long way to go.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's been like 50 years since I read it. So
Sometimes I think it's both, Michael. So, you know, just in the sense that we have this esoteric, you know, deeper understanding to infinite degrees. It's obviously no end to the depth you can go, but the outer circle seems to be just as much real, in the sense that it's in some way like a mirror of that center of the ship. You're talking about the cylinder. It's got its center of observation, and the opposite of that would be one where you don't have this vast, the opposite of the infinite would be the finite, right? So you've got this confinement, but it's still true because it's a mirror. It's true in the sense that it's a reflection of the truth. The
Yes.
exoteric reflects that reality to us, which we find ourselves between both of those things. We find ourselves between the esoteric and the exoteric, seeing what they are to each other, and then we're looking at the whole story. We're looking at we're not polarized one way or the other per se, and that's the splinter, is that piercing, that something that's beyond both realities in a sense. It's
Right.
like it's
Right.
like a hint. We can't quite put our finger on it. It's almost like trying to look at yourself, but you can't, right? You're trying to look in a mirror somewhere, and I really like toying with just exploring that, because in every aspect of our lives we find ourselves in these paradigms where there's whether it's with your wife or with some other person, or just in your spiritual pursuit, you're always kind of oscillating between these two realities, and the truth is really in between. It's supposed to be lived out through the story itself. So that story, Orphans of the Sky, is true in the most holistic sense. Holist. I'm gonna make up words now. So
Yeah.
because sometimes in the spiritual pursuit, we're so drawn toward the center that we neglect the exoteric and think it's not part of the story, but it's so much part of the story. It's so important that
Yes.
we don't forget that is as much part of our reality as the center is, and it's a
Yes.
strange paradigm.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. That's why, and the example that comes to mind is the way we call God Father, or we call God Mother, where we have a reference to the Holy Family, which is male, female, child, right? Father, mother, child.
Mm-hmm.
And that's I think that gets at what you're saying. I mean, that's so real in itself, and it's directly linked to the abstract levels of what that is embodying. So I think that maybe the core teaching of Christianity, it's not love, it's not do unto others even, or any of that. It is the incarnation. That's the central story. That's the central teaching, because that's the union of heaven and earth. That's where getting to that state of consciousness where you can see earth and heaven together.
Mm.
That's the whole point. You see?
It's an interesting thought on that. Speaking of Christianity and the incarnation, when Jesus spoke the words, "Father, why have you forsaken me?"
Mm-hmm.
we tend to think of that as a moment of agony, but I think it was the opposite of that. I think it was a moment of realization that he realized the total unity with his Father. It seemed to be preceding that. It's just a thought. I could be off on that. I might be
Yeah.
missing.
Yeah, and I know what you're trying to do, I think, is to get at the reality of something by looking at its opposite side, and then finding how those two,
Yeah.
join into one thing. But with that particular instance with Jesus on the cross, I have experienced this, to some extent, not, maybe not like he did, but myself out of the equation, I can speak to it because I can say I've at least glimpsed it. And the way I experience that is that there's a point of individuation, of becoming so individuated that you are no longer affected by anything external. And it is a state of being that is utterly alone, which is like, you can take the word alone and break it down and it's all one. But the way we experience that oneness is this utter aloneness. And I think that the Sufis have a way of putting it too. It's how do they put it? It's the journey. They describe the spiritual path as the journey of the alone to the alone. So there is a real experience in that, and it's all encapsulated in that one verse about Jesus, going through that experience. This is like the initiation of self-realization. This is where it's individuation to the extreme, but you come out the other side of it and you come back, and then your entire perspective is changed. So, and can't really say much about that because you have to go there, right? You have to have the experience before you can know what it is. But I can vouch for the interpretation of the story is pretty much like it says, like Jesus saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And, I think that's actually the 22nd Psalm. And Jesus, one thing about Jesus, which is very instructive, is that in his most dire points in his life, he never tried to argue his way out of anything. All he did was quote scripture. All he did. It's what he did. He quoted scripture. And there's a deep lesson in that, which is worthy of contemplation. Because when he was on the cross, at that point where he's about to die, he quoted scripture. When he was tempted by the devil in the wilderness, which was really his own shadow elements coming up to tempt him, he didn't argue with it. He quoted scripture. You see? So I'm just tossing that out there as something you might want to meditate on. There's something about this physical existence that we have, where we find ourselves in this plane of vibration and the other planes, because this is not all there is, and it's not. We're not bound to this one plane, because we can rise up in consciousness and visit the heaven worlds. We can descend in consciousness and look at the subhuman realms of consciousness. I mean, we have that, and like you say, we're in the middle, we're right in between those things, but that gives us agency. It gives us a point of a pivot point. That, the Star of David with the dot in the center, that's the heaven and earth. It's like the upper and the lower, and we're right in the middle. So and when we talk about Jesus Christ being the mediator, when we look at that esoterically, we are the mediator. We mediate between the upper and lower realms of consciousness.
Well, this is why I think this is why I think that what Jesus said there overlays perfectly onto everyone's life, really, at many levels, at various points, is we've all been forsaken by our fathers. I don't think there's anyone who hasn't, especially in our time. And we can relate, in fact, we can speak through that scripture, and we can put ourselves in that place and realize at some point that we were forsaken by our fathers, or we thought we were, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
We
Mm-hmm.
believed that we were, because, like you say, individuation. But in order to realize that the Father and the Son are one, there has to be this illusion of separation for a time. And I really do think that every one of us experiences that on many levels, especially the physical now, which is very easy for us to see. We can all admit, I don't think there's a perfect father out there that in fact, in some ways, it is important that we realize that our fathers never really, we were never forsaken. Each one of us has a father. You can't forget that there's this map within your own life that overlays perfectly well onto the greater reality. And each one of us has a father. And at some point, we had experienced a traumatic event, feeling separated from our father at some point, in some way.
Yeah. No, I like that.
It seems inevitable. It's like the umbilical cord detaching and you're individuating. But that's the moment of realization. That's why I think that that moment where Jesus was saying that, as horrific as it seemed, the greater truth to it is the Father and the Son are one. And something about him speaking that in that moment seems to be a profound realization in that particular moment.
Yeah.
I know it seems horrific, but there's something beautiful behind it. And I can't quite put my finger on it, but I'm just...
Right. Well, it's through suffering, right? I mean, that's a key part of the story, is that, life is suffering. But I think what you're describing, so, and you said many levels, and like the level that we're looking at here, I think, is the psychological level in terms of a rite of passage. And it's like, and you're right, we all have a father. Maybe it might relate to what Freud called the superego, or you can call it our future selves, which always acts as a judge. So we live our lives to please our father, to please our future self, because we look back from this point to our past and we judge it, right? This was good, that was the mistake. So what we could be looking at here in terms of my God, why hast thou forsaken me, is that rite of passage, but on a spiritual level, where it's not like you become one with the Father, you become a father.
Yeah.
And in an emotional, psychological sense, it's when a man becomes a father that changes him.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a rite of passage that has deep transformational effect on a man, the same way becoming a mother has on a woman.
It's almost beyond words. But
well, at a certain point, yeah, words fail to describe it, but we can use words up to that point to broaden our perspective.
In the story of The Lion King, I don't know if you guys are familiar. I'm sure everyone is. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
When Simba sees in his own reflection the face of the father, he immediately takes responsibility as the father. He immediately returns to his rightful place and so on, and brings life back to the kingdom. So there seems to be a pattern there.
Yeah, yeah, I saw it. I saw the same thing. I took Taekwondo for a while, and from a guy who he was like twice national champion of South Korea. He's a real deal. He was like 7th degree black belt or something like that, and taught the local police department, and had a well-established school and nationally known, all of that. And he ran his school kind of like a monastery, and so the initiations within it, which was a great graduation into through the various levels to brown belt and then to black belt. And I was able to watch his students go from brown belt to black belt, and it changed them. Something about them changed. I mean, fundamentally, not just psychologically, not just emotionally, and certainly not just physically. I witnessed a spiritual change in these people, because he was the real deal. He was like a master, right, in that tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so dramatic that I remember shaking the hand of a guy that I knew well enough to have shook his hand before, but it was like even his hand felt different. It felt like he had steel for bones. And so it's there's a transformation that takes place. And that's really what this is about. And what that story of Jesus on the cross is talking about is a transformation. It's where you become a different being. And in order to become a different being, it's like he said, unless you lose your life for my sake, you won't find it. You won't have your life. So when Jesus went through that initiation, he became that. You see, but in order for him to become that, the Jesus part of him had to die. You see, and all, even in the Great Pyramid, in the king's chamber, which was an initiation chamber, they would put the initiate in that box and put the lid on it with but they wouldn't tell him what they were doing. They were just they'd make him think that they're going to put him in the box and leave him there to die. And the Australian Aborigines do the same thing. They send the kids out on the walkabout where there are very real dangers, where there's no assurance that they're going to survive. So there's something about initiation, in order for it to really stick, where you have to die. It's on some level, you have to die. And if you die physically, well, then you got the next lifetime to try it again, right? So, but there is the dying of the old so that the new can be born. You see, that's the pattern. And that's all laid out in the life of Jesus. And that becomes then the way that we have to follow. But we're following a pattern, we're following the context, not the content, right? In other words, we don't have to die on a cross. We don't have to be executed. We don't have to go through all of that. But we do have to go through that pattern.
I don't think people know how to die, but I think they know how to be born again into something new. I think the idea of dying seems so foreign. I don't think anyone knows how to do that, but I think if we're willing to accept the new, we can be born into something else and let go.
Well, how
letting
often
go is like the dying, I guess.
Well, how often do people risk their lives to save another? Hell, people will risk their lives to save an animal. They'll jump into freezing water to save a dog. So we have a good.
I mean, I probably wouldn't do that, but it's just...
it'd have to be a pretty good dog, right?
Yeah.
But you get the point. There's that heroism aspect that we are willing to die for something greater than ourselves, and that's part of the pattern. Yeah.
but you're acknowledging the greater.
Yeah. Yeah.
You wouldn't do it if you thought it was just the end. No
Or
one
if you
would.
thought it was
No,
meaningless, if you thought it was
that's it.
meaningless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There has to be something next. There has to be a reason, even if you don't know what it is. I think deep down, we know that putting our life on the line for our children or whatever
God
the
and country,
reason.
you know, yeah.
Yeah, we know there's something greater than ourselves, so we're willing to submit ourselves to it. But to just submit yourself to death, period,
Right,
seems
right.
like it's only one. It's too much of a half truth, and it needs to be balanced by the greater side of things. You know, the
Exactly. Yeah. Otherwise, all you have is the sterility of nihilism.
exactly.
If nothing means anything. Yeah.
I struggled with that for a while, so that's why I'm trying to introduce the other side, because if you just look
Yeah.
at the one, you can look at it as long as you want. You're never going to develop the courage to face it until you balance it with the other side, which is the life, the
Right. But, you know, I think that in order to really approach this whole thing with any realism at all, we have to face that, you know, we have to come face to face with the what if nothing means anything, you know, what if dying is the end? What if there is no heaven, no hell, you know, like Lennon
face
said.
it for sure. Yeah. I think the inevitable outcome, though, is if you face it long enough, you see you see that that's a reflection. It's an inversion of something else. It's in and of itself, it's not the whole truth.
Yeah.
Just as
well, this
everything.
is what, you know, this is what Ken Wilber called the dignity of modernity. He said that, you know, like for an atheist who doesn't believe in anything after this life, like this is all there is, where they still live an ethical, moral life, not for the promise of future reward or for even something as vague as spiritual development. They do it because it's the right thing to do. You see, and that's a necessary stage that we all have to go through as well. You know, at some point we have to face that blank wall. And this I have experienced. It's like a black doorway where you cannot see through the doorway. You know you have to step through it. You don't even know if you're going to step on anything solid, but you step through it. In total, it even goes beyond faith. There's something much deeper even than faith that enables us to confront reality regardless of what reality might be. You see, and that would be the greater, right? But when you're faced with that, where you don't know if there's something on the other side of that black doorway, that takes guts. You know, that takes a person does not, a person has to go through a lot of experience before they're even able to do that. So, and we do it, you know, we do it all the time anyway, just on a lower level. You know, we quit our job and go looking for a new job, or we, you know, break up one relationship and go looking for another. It's the same kind of thing. You don't know what you're going to get, but you're doing it because you're doing it.
Yeah. And the doorway that you're faced with is the one that you're faced with. And we're always faced with some thing to step into.
But don't mistake the content for the context. You know, the doorway is universal. There's just one doorway, and every human being at some point in their spiritual evolution will face that one doorway, because it's not a thing, right? It's not a physical door.
Right.
It's an abstraction. It's real, but it's on a different level of reality. So we don't want to get into the relativism of, you know, well, you have your door and I have my door.
I didn't mean it that way, but I know you could definitely go that way.
Yeah, yeah. Like initiation, the path of initiation, it's the same for everyone. It is the same at every level. It's the same path. And that's where in Christianity, they say there's only one way. And they say that, Jesus Christ is the only Son of God. See, that's what those statements really mean. They're naming a universal principle, a universal reality. It's even more than a principle. It's a real experience, but everybody goes through that same experience. And regardless of who they are, right? We all go through that. We all go through the baptism. We go through the illumination. We go through self-realization, and then beyond. And that's in order to know the particular, you must understand the universal, because the universal is where all the particular comes from. It doesn't start with the particular. That's not how creation works. It starts with the one, and the one becomes the 10,000 things in Taoism. But there's a definite sequence. That's why the creation of the world in Genesis, took 7 days, and these different things were done on each of those days. It's all symbolic language for a universal experience. And it starts with, in the beginning, so what do we have there? We have the very concept, the very notion of sequence, because we know that sequence matters. You go to bake a chocolate cake, sequence matters. You got to do this first, then that, then you get a cake. You mix that up.
Experience.
Yeah. So if you mix that up, you're not going to come out with a cake. So and here we have in these teachings that are thousands of years old, the seed thought, the seed ideas, the seed principles for science. Because like in chemistry, sequence is everything. Structure, there is pattern. These are basic understandings of reality, and they're all hidden within the stories of the Old Testament and the Vedas, and in the Tao Te Ching. It's all there if you know how to read it. Science, see, here's a good example. It wasn't science first and then religion. No, it was religion and then science. Religion set it up so that science could come into being.
Michael,
yes.
have you thought about, or is there even a need to maybe do an online Bible contemplation weekly? Like we used to do with Andrew, with and then going internally and looking at yourself internally.
Yeah. I've been kind of circling around that for a little while now. I think it's time to get back into having a Bible class.
Yeah,
so,
I do miss that. Yeah, that was pretty enlightening.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about that, because I know I experienced it when I was in the OCS, but it never made a lot of sense to me. But maybe we can talk about it, and I can see it through your eyes. We can explore into that, because it was really experiential, wasn't it? It was like we'd read a verse and then feel the impact of it, and then talk about it.
Yeah, and each person in the story is an internal part.
Oh yeah, that I can do. I can do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, let's do that. Maybe I'll write something up and then put it out there, and maybe that's the direction we need to go in these classes, because I'm kind of running out of things to talk about. Not really. I can go on forever.
Well, it's nice to have the open aspect, but maybe we could find a middle path where we have like what Renee, is it Renee?
Yeah.
Renee's saying, you know, incorporate that structure.
Yeah, we'll start with, you know, just reading it and seeing what comes up.
It's a cool idea.
Yeah. And I've had a lot of things lately just kind of landing in my lap. I'll be thinking of you know, some aspect of the teachings, and then it just becomes obvious, well, this is what Jesus meant when he said that, or this is what Moses was actually saying, or what God was actually saying to Moses, you know, and it just starts to really make sense. All right. Well,
Great. Looking forward to next time.
yes, me too. All right. Well, Renee, maybe you and I can talk about it if you've got time
Sure.
sometime, and we'll explore it. Let me, you know, think about it and write up an outline, and
I mean, I can tell you
get together.
what we did with Andrew, and then, you know, see if that's.
Yeah, yeah, good.
Okay.
All right, guys. As always, it's been a real pleasure.
Yes.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
Everybody.
See you later. Enjoy your Saturday.
Yeah.
Thank
have a
you.
good weekend.
You too.